Greetings, everyone. I'm Lisa Parker from the Center for Bioethics and Health Law, where I direct a master's program in bioethics. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, David Barnard. If the center has a faculty member who is sort of the modern-day Renaissance man, I would say that it is indeed David. He received his bachelor's from the University of Chicago, a Master of Arts in Comparative History from Brandeis, a Master of Theological Studies from Harvard Divinity School, and a PhD in Religion and Society from Harvard University in 1980. His involvement with the health professions began in 1971 with 3 years as a respiratory therapist, which impressed upon him the ethical, spiritual, psychological dimensions of healthcare. And it's a subject that's occupied the balance of his life, professional life, research and teaching. He's devoted the last 25 years to teaching and writing on these subjects in academic health centers, and has become an authority on the role of the humanities in medicine and medical training. David's bookshelves reflect his academic and personal commitments. There you'll find such volumes as The Philosophy of Martin Buber, Nietzsche, Plato, Kant, Richard Rorty, Durkheim's Suicide, Dewey's Art as Experience, The Interpretation of Cultures by Geertz, The Plague by Camus, and a book of self-portraits of Rembrandt. You'll also find a copy of his own co-authored volume, Crossing Over, Narratives of Palliative Care, which was published in 2000 with Oxford University Press, as well as 2 co-edited volumes of his, Chronic Illness from Experience to Policy, and Nourishing the Humanistic in Medicine, Interactions with the Social Sciences. In recent years, particularly since beginning to pursue and then receiving a degree in law from the University of Pittsburgh in 2006, David has directed his attention to issues in health and human rights. He's now a member of the core faculty in the Global Health Track for the Internal Medicine Residency Program in the School of Medicine. And at the School of Law, he serves as the faculty advisor for the Global Health and Human Rights Track in the Health Law Certificate Program. His research focuses on the strengths and limitations of the international human rights framework for addressing global health inequities, particularly in the poorest regions of the world. Today, we'll be talking about law, human rights, and women's health. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, David Barnard.
Very good. Nice to be here with you. Thank you for coming. I don't know about that Renaissance man business. I think it might be because I'm not very good with computers or something. Have that, but I'll take the compliment anyway. As Lisa mentioned, I'm a relatively recent graduate of the law school here, and I want to just give you one very brief way of understanding that. Most of the work that I've done in the medical school in particular has involved palliative care, end-of-life care. And a few years ago, it struck me that in the United States at least, a major driver of the growth of the palliative care movement and hospice care has been the recognition that there comes a point in one's life when you can have too much medical care. And hospitals, doctors are not what you want and not what you need. And palliative care, and well, the hospice movement in particular, has grew up as a way of giving people an alternative to the healthcare system for maximizing their quality of living at the end of their life. It struck me, though, a few years ago, and maybe it was late coming to me, that the problem of too much health care is actually relatively, for the United States, that may be a problem for people, at least wealthier middle-class people. But on a global scale, the problem has actually not been too much health care or finding a way out of the healthcare system, but it's been the problem of actually getting some health care and getting into a healthcare system. And that observation led me to think more seriously about social and political and economic aspects of health and healthcare, and also around this time, the discipline of bioethics, not for the first time, but in a new way, actually began looking not so much at the question of the ethical dimensions of the healthcare professions, but ethical aspects of health, and particularly the distribution of health and ill health around the world. And it was only about maybe 10 or 12 years ago that Dan Brock, a philosopher now at Harvard, then at Brown University, gave the presidential address at a major bioethics meeting, which I think had the title something like the Bioethics of Health. And everybody thought, well, wait, something fell off his title. He meant the bioethics of healthcare, didn't he? And he actually said, no, I didn't mean the bioethics of healthcare, because healthcare is really only one of the ingredients of health. That what determines people's opportunities to lead a healthy life actually has more to do with their social, economic, educational setting, circumstances and situation, than just about anything else. And it was that beginning, really, that was the beginning of a turning point for people like Brock, who now actually is at Harvard and has gotten very involved in questions of global health, inequalities, and inequities. So in a way, I've followed a little bit in that direction, hence going to the law school, talking about issues particularly of human rights law and health. And I want to give you this afternoon just a little bit of some of the thinking that I've done as a result of those studies, and also now working with some law students who are interested in health and human rights within the Health Law Certificate Program that Alan Meisel directs. So what I'm really going to try to do is say something about how I see the relationships among the three terms in the title of my talk here. And I'm going to do that by looking not just in an abstract way, but with a very direct focus on the situation of women's health in the country of Ethiopia, which is the result of some research that I have done at the law school, and which helps focus in a very concrete way some of the themes that I want to develop. And the first point to make, in my opinion, about the relationships among law, human rights, and women's health is sort of a good news and a bad news situation. And we all have our favorite good news and bad news jokes. My favorite one happens to be the doctor calls you and says, I have some good news and I have some bad news. You say, well, what's the good news? The doctor says you have 24 hours to live. You say, well, what's the bad news? I was supposed to have called you yesterday. So, in the context of law, human rights, and women's health, the good news is that health as a fundamental human right has been recognized as a politically negotiated agreement, primarily among most of the countries of the world, and codified in international law, international human rights treaties, agreements. And you have, as a handout, a very brief excerpt from Article 12, which is Article 12 of one of these documents, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, as well as brief excerpts from the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, where some of the particular language appears in these documents. That the human rights regime, as it has emerged in international law, actually sets up as legal obligations and not mere aspirations, but legal obligations of nation states who are signatories to these treaties, undertaking to protect, respect, and fulfill the rights for the people for whom they have responsibility. And there are mechanisms for the monitoring of these, the performance of states A special rapporteur has been appointed by the United Nations to investigate how states are complying worldwide with their obligations for health under the international treaties. The World Health Organization and other non-governmental organizations have increasingly adopted what they would refer to as a rights-based approach to carrying out their work, which essentially means, among other things, looking to make sure that policies that they undertake are consistent with and supportive of the international obligations that have been specified in these treaties. So that's all good news. What's the bad news? Well, the bad news is that enforcement of human rights obligations is weak to non-existent. That particularly with respect to the rights that are enshrined in the Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, states give themselves a gigantic loophole through a phrase known as the progressive realization of these rights, which essentially has been interpreted to mean, well, yes, we'll get there someday when we're finished dealing with all the other things that we think we have to do and when we can find some money to do them. The difference between, actually, it's interesting from a sexual standpoint, the notion of progressive realization doesn't appear in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which was the other major document here. There, you're supposed to uphold those rights completely right away, such as, and it's easier to do it, like don't torture people. Well, most countries find it easy to do that. You know, it's not like you have to progressively move towards a point where you're not torturing people or you're guaranteeing people the right to vote. You should be able to do that right away. But the more positive, affirmative obligations of providing such things as health, some of what have been identified as social welfare rights, there the argument has been made, well, you can't hold us to an immediate standard of accomplishment there. But so that has provided a loophole. Another problem, another bit of the bad news is that there's a kind of an irony that these human rights agreements that states sign are set up to protect individuals within countries from rights violations by their governments. But when it comes to enforcement, who does the international human rights regime look to for enforcement of these rights? Those same governments. So that you have a kind of fox and chicken coop situation here. And the concomitant assumption in international relations of state sovereignty means that even when someone is seen to be a violator of human rights, what is the international community going to do about it? The notion that every state ought to be able to be responsible for its own internal affairs, even in the current climate where we begin to see the United Nations endorse the notion of the responsibility to protect citizens of one country against egregious violations of human rights. We've watched how difficult it is for that to have any concrete meaning in the world, and I think it will be a long time before a state's performance on the notion of providing health care would rise to that level of international intervention. And there are a lot of other arguments that have been raised. Philosophically, the grounding, the foundations of human rights have always been contested. The idea that cultures may vary in what they would define as a core or right throws into some question the idea that these are truly universal human rights in a defensible way. And there are people who would argue, in fact, that the notion of a human rights regime is another way for Western imperialism to exert its control over the whole planet. And on each of those last points, I think is debatable, but nonetheless, it's part of the good news and the bad news that we have to deal with. And so what I'd like to do, with that as a background, is say something about how these tensions may play out in a particular setting. And the first thing we will notice is that there is an enormous contrast between the formal legal undertakings, even of countries unlike the United States, which have ratified most of the human rights treaties, there is a big gap between the formal acceptance of legal obligations and what's actually going on for people's lives. And what I want to argue at the end of this, by the end of this, is that despite that gap, human rights and the human rights regime remain quite relevant for improvement of women's health. But in order to maximize its relevance, we need to think about human rights in ways other than simply the mechanisms of the international formal human rights regimes. And I want to say a little something about what I mean by that. So the first place to begin for me is to really say that there's a couple of stories that we need to keep in mind. Two narratives of, you might say. And the first is the narrative, the storyline of the human rights revolution, you might call it, since World War II. This is Eleanor Roosevelt looking at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which she was a critical agent in shepherding through into being right after World War II. And in fact, this story continues with a whole list of treaties. These are just a handful of the major treaties. Can people on this side of the room actually? Okay. See, and again, I've excerpted some relevant language from the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the Treaty on Women. The second page, or the back side of the handout, is a brief excerpt from a document called General Comment 14, written by the committee, the United Nations committee that's charged with the monitoring of compliance with the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And this is a document. General comments are issued by this committee in the form of guidance. They're not, you wouldn't call them strictly, they're sort of like advisory opinions. In the legal sense, they are not binding documents, but they are helping to shape people's interpretation. And the key element in that particular document that I would call your attention to is in the second paragraph of General Comment 14, the one that's there, paragraph 11, where the committee emphasizes that the conditions and determinants of health go far beyond access to health care. Now, they enumerate specifically things like safe and potable water, sanitation, food, nutrition, housing, environmental, occupational conditions, but they would actually, in other sections of that very important document, talk also about the broader panoply of social conditions that are, I think, and we'll talk a little bit more about those in the context of Ethiopia, cultural practices and economic, political status that also are critical determinants of health. So under their interpretation, your obligation to uphold the commitments under this treaty extends much more broadly than just assuring formal access to a healthcare system. Now, the second narrative that we have to acknowledge is women's inequality and its health consequences worldwide. And this statement by the chief of the Africa section of UNIFEM, which is one of the major UN agencies related to women's development, saying the face of poverty in Africa is still a woman, the face of HIV/AIDS is still a woman. It is easier to change structure, but it is not easy to change patriarchy. Essentially encapsulates a crucial link between poverty, inequality, and ill health, particularly for women. And a kind of graphic illustration of this may be a little too small to see. So what you just concentrate on the colored bars. These are different countries of the world, a number of them in Africa. And the slide is illustrating the prevalence of HIV among people, of women 15 to 24 years of age compared to men. So the blue bars represent the prevalence of HIV infection in men in these countries, age 15 to 24. The green bars, Swaziland is the one up top here, Ethiopia is not on this list, but it would not be all that different from some of these. The green bars are women. So women are bearing an enormous burden of HIV infection. And you contrast that with another slide that represents the same colors. Blue are men, women are green. The percent of the population that have comprehensive and correct knowledge of HIV/AIDS. In other words, how it's transmitted and some of the ways of protecting yourself. You notice that it's reversed. Men know more about this. So women are both bearing the brunt and are less likely to have access to relevant information. So we're looking at inequalities and health implications right across the board. And in fact, if we think about what I would call the linkage between poverty, patriarchy, and illness, we see among the most frequently and importantly encountered themes would be maternal mortality. We'll look at a few statistics shortly, but the fact remains that about 500,000 women die every year giving birth or in the period immediately after giving birth. And in the developed world, like the United States, if a woman dies in childbirth, it's almost always the result of an unpredictable, sudden event that there was simply no way of intervening to stop it. Whereas if a woman dies of childbirth in the developing world, the reasons are probably 99% of the time due to things that are absolutely preventable. And it's the lack of available resources and skills at the time that is the explanation for the death. Talk a little bit about HIV/AIDS. Female genital cutting is another major source of ill health, psychological as well as physical for women, that can be identified, although there is argument here from some anthropologists, issues of poverty and patriarchy. And then the distribution of a number of occupational illnesses, which, for example, respiratory disease in a number of settings which result from cooking over open fires in enclosed places, which tends to be a gendered activity. Carrying and being involved with water exposes women to waterborne parasites in many communities as an occupational hazard, much more than men. Musculoskeletal problems resulting from, again, gendered responsibilities, carrying water and wood and other things long distances that many communities assign preferentially, I use the word lightly, to women. Well, the question is then, do these narratives have anything to do with each other? The human rights narrative, with its eloquent language about rights and equality and non-discrimination and access to the social determinants of health, and the narrative, the brief sketch of women's issues. And so that's what we want to talk about. And the question is that I ask and my law students ask is, what, if anything, should advocates for women's health expect from the human rights regime as tools for or resources for improvement in women's health? So to talk about that a little bit in the context of Ethiopia, I start with this map because there are important geopolitical issues to be acknowledged. Africa is in a very volatile part of the continent. Ethiopia is in a very volatile part of the continent. Enormous tensions, actually, including Christian Islamic tensions. Somalia and Eritrea, which actually is not visible here, are Muslim. Ethiopia is primarily predominantly Christian, although it has Muslim communities. It's a heavily militarized society, which has undergone its own internal histories of human rights violations, particularly in the 1980s and 90s under the regime that overthrew the emperor, Haile Selassie, and then in a considerable amount of violence in the country leading up to a new constitution in 1994. It's also a very poor country. It is a country that is divided into very clearly ethnically diverse states. And the federal system of Ethiopia is another part of the issue that we would have to look at when we think about the human rights regime. This is an ethnic federation with great regional autonomy. And federal law enforcement is extremely weak. The Constitution makes it clear that the federal government defers and devolves a great deal to these ethnically diverse areas, which are much more likely to be influenced by tribal customs and a lot of historical practices. Now, an example, as the family law, the official laws governing marriage and divorce and so forth in Ethiopia, passed in 1960, explicitly has a clause that says that the husband is the head of the household. Okay? That's the law. That was the law of Ethiopia. And it had ramifications for a number of other provisions in the family code. In 2000, the family code was revised and that language was removed. And the new document, consistent with the Constitution, which we'll look at in a second, is much more egalitarian. The problem is that due to the incredible federalism in Ethiopia, the family code is actually only enforced in the capital of Addis Ababa and in one other area, Dir Adiwa, which is right here. The rest of the regions are actually been able to continue under the existing 1960 family law. And women lawyers in Ethiopia, that's one of the things that they are actively engaged at, to try to really have nationwide enforcement of this federal law. Now, when it comes to some of the basic statistics, the Human Development Report from the United Nations from 07-08, I should say, by the way, that these slides will be on our website at the Center for Bioethics and Health Law in a few days, I'm told. So please check there. There may even be the results of the North Carolina provisional ballot count. I don't know. So you can see what we have here on these slides is I've got Ethiopia's data followed by the best data and the worst data in the world. Okay? Well, I see things are not, and then the U.S. So in this case, you see the annual estimates of life expectancy for Ethiopia, the worst in the world, the best in the world, and the USA. Similarly, down here, you see the GDP per capita, $1,000 roughly for Ethiopia compared to Iceland. So the USA sometimes is the best in the world. That's why it shows up a little funny. But outside the US, the best actually is Iceland, although this was all before their banks collapsed. So I don't know if that slide is completely accurate. Populations living under a certain amount of money, $1 a day, $2 a day. You can see 78% of Ethiopians live on $2 or less a day. Water, improved water is available for 22% of the population. Sanitation available for 13%. Undernourished population, 46%. 3 physicians per 100,000 people. Iceland, actually, look at that, 362. I'm not sure how to account for that, actually. If anybody knows about Iceland better than I do, that's a pretty astonishing figure. Now, here, maternal mortality. To give you a framework, 870 women per 100,000 live births die. Sierra Leone, unfortunately, that's just absolutely breathtaking figure of 2,100 women. Compared to Iceland, which is the best in the world, and then the US. Partly related to this figure is this figure, that only 6% of births are attended by skilled attendants in Ethiopia, compared to 99% in the US. Norway is about the same. Infant mortality rate per 1,000 live births. Now this is not, these would be different if we disaggregated according to quintiles of the population. So the richer you are, you're better off. But we just, for simplicity's sake, to give you an idea of infant mortality compared to some other parts of the world. Another piece, the window onto women's health in Ethiopia, female genital cutting. That's a contested phrase even. Some people would prefer the term female circumcision, others female genital mutilation. And the prevalence of this is remarkably high, ranging from the low of 46% in the southern region to 94%, almost universally practiced in FR. And many of you may know about the practice. There are really three broad levels of this procedure, ranging from small clitoral cutting to major excisions of the area to infibulation, which would be not only the removal of a more major part of the external genitalia, but then sewing together. It is usually, as in the case of much of Africa, the regions with the highest prevalence are usually also the regions that have the most extensive versions of the practice. Okay? So, yeah, okay. So what I want to do now is just, that's some data. That's just some snapshots. Some of the background. But now let's look again in terms of formal legal commitments. The Constitution of 1994 of Ethiopia points out that all international agreements are, including the human rights treaties, are considered to be part of the Ethiopian national law, and that they should interpret all of the provisions of their constitution in terms of the Universal Declaration and the covenants and so forth. Ethiopia was an early ratifier of the Convention on the Against Discrimination of Women, 1981. That's as early as you could sign on to that convention, actually. Again, the United States has not ratified it, nor have we ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We did ratify this one. We have not ratified this international covenant. So Ethiopia is on record. You notice the ones that were ratified, there was kind of a flurry of activity in the early 90s, and that was as part of this movement away from the dictatorship and the establishment of the new constitution. So they've been signatories for the major documents for a reasonable length of time. Now, I mentioned about the Constitution and egalitarianism as far as women are concerned. You see that women have equal rights with men in marriage, but we have to remember those regional variations in terms of actual legislation to enforce that. Article 35 points out that the Constitution holds the state responsible for enforcing the right of women to eliminate influences of harmful customs. Okay, including such things, you might say, as female genital cutting, and to prevent harm from arising from childbirth. So these are formal commitments, and what we're trying to do is say, okay, we have this formal set of commitments, and then we have the realities. How do we understand it? And I would say that the first place to look is, in fact, at the phenomenon of gender inequality itself. Thinking about now all of this with respect to the determinants of health. You can see, for example, data related to literacy and education. Overall, adult literacy rate about 35%, whereas women are at 22.8%, and their ratio, about half as many women in Ethiopia are able to read as men. And you see when you get actually a little bit older, the ratio improves a little bit, but it's still 0.6. School enrollment, women are considerably behind, although some improvement lately. And this is, to me, a fascinating slide. I don't know if it's big enough for you to read it, but it is a survey that was done in the late 1990s, a community village-based survey of activities, daily activities, and the hours spent in various activities by women and men. Okay, this was a document, this was World Bank working collaboratively with an Office of Women's Affairs in Ethiopia, collected this data. And it's interesting, the women, compare the women's schedule, okay, to the men's. Now I'll just point out the rest periods here for the men, okay? They do some work, collect cow dung from 6 to 7 in the morning, and then rest from 7 to noon. Untie the cattle from 12 to 1, rest from 1 to 5. Okay? Tie the cattle from 5 to 6, eat, rest, go to bed. Okay? 3 working hours. Women, 14 working hours. And you can see, and the implication here, I think, is more on the area of the opportunity costs to women. What they don't have time to do, such as read about their human rights, okay? Or learn how to read so they can read about their human rights. Networking, participating in politics. These are things that are simply unavailable through the gender distribution of work responsibilities. And you're therefore not surprised to see that women in Parliament, although on a world scale that's not horrible, in 2008, 21.9% of the Parliament were women, 7% at the ministerial level. This will show you world comparisons. This is women's representation in parliaments in different regions of the world. You see sub-Saharan Africa, 16% of parliamentarians are women. South Asia, 15. In the developing world, it's up to as high as 26. And if you extrapolate the rate of increase of women's participation in government through parliaments, what this graph shows you is that at the present rate by which women are increasing their level of participation, parity with men, which is defined as 40% and above, will be achieved 40 years from now. Okay? So that's partly to set Ethiopian women's experience in a broader global context. In terms of the specific determinants of health, a very graphic way of illustrating this, these connections is from a passage from a case developed by a seminar of women and women's health experts in Ethiopia in the late 1990s, describing a young woman died who had been given in marriage at 13 years of age, lost her first pregnancy, but was damaged due to an obstructed labor resulting probably from the disproportion between the baby's head size and her birth structure. 3 years following the repair of her damaged birth canal, she again became pregnant, so now she's 16, maybe 17. At 7 months pregnancy, she started bleeding after carrying a heavy jar of water from a distant source. She started labor the same day, but did not make it to the hospital until 3 days later. By then, the baby had no sign of life, and she was in severe distress. She was delivered, and the uterus was removed on the 27th day of admission and medical care. She passed away. And the commentator on this wants us to look at the elements in this little vignette that have nothing, that are beyond the biological. That's the point of this case. There's not a single cause for her death, the commentator said. Being young, married, doing heavy work during pregnancy, physical disproportion, no health services close by, and no time to seek out the faraway health service all contributed. The gender-assigned job of fetching water does not relate to the sex-designated role of pregnancy. All jobs other than pregnancy, labor, delivery, and lactation could be shared if it were not for society's prescription of gender-segregated roles, of which the most burdensome and routine are assigned to women. And in fact, in Ethiopia, in 1990, over 1/3 of married women between 15 and 49 had been married before the age of 15. 41% married between 15 and 17. And in rural areas, the mean marriage age of 15 compares to 21 for men. In the northwest region of the country, it was estimated in 1990 that at least half the women married at the age of 14 or younger. Similarly, you look at the fertility rates for Ethiopia, 2000 to 2005, 5.8 per woman compared to some of these other figures. The use of contraception, 15% compared to 87% in China, 76% in the US. And asking about condom use at the last high-risk sex, women aged 15 to 24, 17% of women. Botswana, 75%. We don't have data from the US. I'm not sure if that's out of embarrassment or what, but we don't have, I just could not find it for this report. Do you know, Alan? Yeah.
No, I actually want to comment on
Yeah.
the previous
Yeah.
slide. I wonder if
Previous
one
slide.
Yeah, well, you don't need to go
Okay.
back. But I wonder if one other potential contributing factor was the fact that she was given in marriage. That, it's hard to know whether that was chosen
Right.
or not.
Right.
Because of the cultural
Correct.
influences of what is
Correct.
given in that culture, it may be that it's the equivalent of choosing.
Yeah. That's right. And this is a little bit related to your comment. This is another provision in the Constitution. And while it's referring to adjudication of disputes, what it's actually referring to is marriage and divorce practices. And much of the practice of marriage is determined by, again, a patriarchal society, which is very threatening to women's autonomous decisions and choices about marriage, and also about decisions about divorce. The Constitution actually, on one hand, provides for equality in the application of laws in matters of divorce and property settlement. Property settlement is a huge issue when it comes to divorce. And where are the household goods going to go? The common practice in many of these villages is for all the property to go back to remain with the husband. There's supposedly a more egalitarian treatment of that in the legal system, but the Article 34 of the Constitution says that it would still be okay to use the local religious or cultural frames for adjudicating this with mutual consent. But that raises the question Alan is alluding to. How likely is it, given the high illiteracy, the traditions really of gendered power structure, that women will be aware of their ability to withhold consent to go to arbitration? The arbitration boards are 100% men. And in fact, the word for in the local language for the arbitrator actually is the same word as the older man. So the Constitution's provisions are not particularly helpful. I want to show one last bit of data before asking how these human rights, where is human rights in all of this, okay? There were educational initiatives on ending female genital cutting undertaken by a number of NGOs in Africa. CARE has been one of the most active in this area. And I believe the data I'm showing you came from one of their programs, Reproductive Health in Ethiopia and Kenya. And they conducted a survey, among other things, to get some attitudinal information. And so what's interesting to me, here are the questions, for example, do you agree or disagree that your partner has more say than you do about important decisions that affect both of you? You see that mostly the women would agree that the partner has more say. About twice as many women would say that. There are still 32% of the men who thought that their wife had more say. Who gets their way most of the time? The men assume it's them most of the time. Women should have equal opportunities to hold senior positions. Men think actually more than women. This is interesting, but what's really interesting to me is the ratio of no opinion. Okay? 17% of the women had no opinion about this. And that pattern continues in these other questions. In terms of girls should have equal rights as a boy child, 4 times as many women had no opinion as men on this. Appropriate for a woman to express feelings of sexual satisfaction, twice as many men agreed with that as women. And again, 39% of women had no opinion. When money is scarce, and you can't afford to send all the kids to school, boys should be sent before girls. Men agreed than that more than women, but again, 3 times as many undecided women. They just had no opinion. To me, it gets back a little bit to Alan's point. The notion of being an autonomous political agent is one, I think, that is something that women have found is very difficult to internalize. And again, when we think about the language of human rights treaties, these are some of the local realities that we really have to think about. So I come back to my question of these narratives and ask again, what should advocates for women's health expect out of a human rights regime which appears to be so distant and formalistic compared to the conditions of women's lives, to the extent that these admittedly highly selective bits of data that I'm showing you here would describe that life. And to get at this, remind you of something that Marty Sen observed in an important article which I highly commend to you called Elements of the Theory of Human Rights. He published in Philosophy and Public Affairs in 2004, which he made the observation that formal legislation is only one vehicle for ensuring the realization of rights, that merely recognizing them and agitating for them also have great potential bearing. And he illustrates this in some very interesting ways. And there's some anecdotes he refers to in this article. One being the notion, for example, we say that a person has the right to speak in a public meeting, but the person is very shy and easily intimidated by crowds. What's the solution to that? Is it a law? Probably not. So if you're interested in encouraging people's participation and realization of rights, we have to think, he would say, more broadly in the formal legal system. However, the formal legal system has been activated by organizations such as the Center for Reproductive Rights in New York. And the treaties and the monitoring mechanisms and the indicators of public accountability are there and available. There are mechanisms to hold states publicly accountable through the reporting procedures, the use of shadow reports. In other words, when a state is asked to submit its every 3-year report to the UN committee is also open to hearing reports about that same country from other agencies. NGOs, groups of lawyers and doctors submit. And that often is a source of tremendously persuasive data that's stimulated by the human rights monitoring process. Of course, the problem is that litigation is very slow and costly. Depends on resources for traveling, for getting experts, or else you have to find someone who's willing to take your case for free. Often the NGOs who take up the cause of particular issues, they're very selective for reasons of ideology or resources. And often what they pick is based on their own agendas, and sometimes can foster government backlash even. Again, on that notion that here come the Western NGOs parachuting in to save us. Nonetheless, you can see this. This will be emphasized in the slides. This is an example of a rights-based approach to safer motherhood conducted by the Physicians for Human Rights in Peru, in which they collected a lot of data, which we've already alluded to, and identified, this is a busy slide, don't worry about it, but the key point is that these 4 characteristics of health care for women having to do with maternal childbirth were what were seen as the problems. Lack of availability, lack of accessibility, lack of acceptability, and lack of quality. And there are actually United Nations and WHO guidelines operationalizing each of these terms into quantifiable numbers of facilities, locations, ambulances that work, telephone lines that work, health stations staffed in certain ways that can be counted and measured. And so you actually have a language within the mechanisms of monitoring and accountability to measure progress and identify problems. Now, it's not the same, of course, as cultivating the political will to change those conditions. And that's really where the second narrative comes in. I illustrate that primarily with the cover of Paulo Freire's book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, to suggest that human rights is not only the formal mechanism of treaty negotiation and signing and monitoring and lawsuits to human rights courts around the world, but human rights has emerged over the last 30 years or so as a language of empowerment, transforming problems into rights violations is a very powerful rhetorical move. To be someone who is a bearer of rights as opposed to a supplicant hoping for the well-meaning attentions of people is a significant internal shift of identity. And Freire, of course, emphasized grassroots community activism and consciousness raising, using educational systems actually to foster critiques of dominant social arrangements. And this has been adapted by the Human Rights community. This book, Human Rights for All, grew out of originally an initiative that we've talked about now with some law students here called Street Law, which is a project to teach teenagers about their legal rights. It's been expanded to teach them about their human rights. We actually have a project going right now that we're beginning here at Pitt. Teaching about human rights as a vehicle really for mobilization and consciousness raising. And I'm going to take one last couple of minutes before we conclude to illustrate, not from Ethiopia, but from Botswana, how these two narratives actually do work together. The formal human rights regime and what I'm identifying as this kind of the local level. In Botswana, you have to understand the context here of the 1984 Citizenship Act in the country of Botswana, under which a man would, by marrying a non-Botswanan, would automatically be able to confer Botswanan nationality citizenship on his spouse and children. Whereas the law denied that same right for women who married a non-Botswanan man. Okay, they did not automatically get citizenship for their husband or any children that the husband might have had. So this spawned a lawsuit initiated by a woman named Unity Dow in Botswana, and issued in a lawsuit a ruling that by the High Court of Botswana that gender differences in the Citizenship Act were unconstitutional and in fact a violation of the non-discrimination provisions of the international human rights agreements. Okay? And in 1992, that was upheld. The next 3 years, Botswana refused to comply with the court decision. They said, well, that may be what the court decided, but we're going to continue to enforce the 1984 law. 1995, however, they passed legislation to comply with the Dow decision. And in 96, Botswana actually ratified the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And you could ask yourself, what was going on here? What was happening in Botswana? And one of the things was happening, very small piece of this, Unity Dow has written about, and this was an intervention that was mirrored in a number of parts of the country, starting with very low-level informal dialogue with women in local areas, began branching out into educational activities having to do with law and its effect on women and families, employment issues, women in politics, constitutional law, and women's health, especially HIV and AIDS prevention and family planning. These grew into the establishment of this education and information center in the village. They then went to the village chief, a man, asked permission to have a community-wide assembly. Many people would say, you see, that's exactly the problem. Men should not be empowered to tell you whether you can have a community-wide assembly or not, which is correct. But as anthropologists who study the local application of human rights law will remind us, part of the experience of transferring internationally negotiated agreements into local change means often compromising some of the principles in ways that the purest of the human rights writers don't necessarily like. In any case, this center now was a base in this community exactly in the years we're talking about now, from 92 up to 94, which included advocacy for ratification of the Women's Convention and compliance with the Dow decision, among a number of other aspects of its agenda. And I would argue that these activities here constitute a kind of reverberation of the, you had to have the Dow and CEDAW as part of the mix here. They became rallying points. They became reference points that were part of the motivation for the kind of lower level participation. So I don't think that one world is completely divorced from the other. Even though Dow was slow to be implemented, it was the important rallying point. And so my last slide here is an observation, again, by those same women who convened in Addis Ababa in 1998, commenting that women's subordination existing in societies of every degree of complexity is not something that can be changed simply by rearranging certain tasks and roles in the social system. Potential for change lies in changing social institutions at the same time as changing cultural assumptions through consciousness raising and involvement of both men and women. And I think going forward, using the human rights regime as resources for advocacy and improvement of women's health is going to involve getting familiar and aggressive at both levels, taking advantage of both narratives of human rights, so that the narrative that we've been seeing of inequality, patriarchy, and poverty in women's health can begin to change. I'll stop
there. Dave, but your premise does say that articulation is permitted governmentally. I'm thinking about China and the real damper on articulation of those expressions which lead people to be able to think about their human rights.
Right.
And there, the culture might be ready, but the government isn't, so that the articulation can occur. I think your point's wonderful here. But I don't know that it works unless the government is somewhat permissive, as this one was, to at least put it in, parts of it in the Constitution to get some writing at the top level.
Yeah. Well, actually, the Chinese, there are provisions of the Chinese Constitution that are not bad. Neither was the Soviet Constitution.
Oh, yeah, that's true. But yet the government still
Yeah, that's right.
is suppressing
That's
articulation.
That's right. And, you know, again, a skeptic would point precisely to that point, that words are cheap, ratification of documents, you know, can be good for public image in the world, and yet repressive forces remain. The question is whether, that I would simply ask, is if you were resisting oppression, would you rather be with or without the record that your country has at least undertaken at some level a legal obligation? And I would argue that you're better off if you can refer to that. But in terms of actual resistance, I mean, you know, revolutions and violence are also what people turn to. They don't simply, say, wave a document in front of people's faces. But your point also is well taken, that there needs to be at least some level of consciousness, forming consciousness, and being permitted to do that. Yeah.
I think that there is a much stronger role for regional treaty bodies and women's rights than universal human rights treaties, because I think that, I mean, of course, some of them are not so good for women, but in general, I think countries are much more likely to oblige if, you know, trade is involved, you know, like Botswana and Ethiopia are much likely to follow a treaty body within Africa, because there's some real consequences, whereas, you know, people, CEDAW, everyone ratified CEDAW, but of course, like, nobody follows it.
Yeah.
And there are no consequences not following, but I think regional ones that really are real consequences.
Well, I think that a lot of the action is there, and there is also a human rights court for Africa. I do think that they run into some of the same enforcement weaknesses that the international ones do, but you're right to point that out. And I was not complete in my narrative of the human rights revolution, because the regional treaty bodies are also the European Convention on Human Rights, the Inter-American Convention on Human Rights, and the African Convention on the Rights of Peoples. Sometimes their language is actually even stronger, and a few of the human rights court decisions that have been handed down at the regional level are remarkable in what they articulate in terms of rights. So that's a great addition. Yeah.
So it seems that while enforcement certainly seems to be a huge problem, it doesn't seem to be the main problem, in the sense that the slides that you were showing where women have no opinion seem to be quite telling. And so what would you say that the first step should be, say, education, or the first step should be a limiting of work hours, or
or all of
some
the
sort of
above?
cultural redistribution of it seems, my question is, this is clearly a problem, what is the first step?
Well, I guess the most important answer to that question that I could give in a setting like this, or this about any, is that is going to depend very much on the women in the communities that we're talking about. That local conditions and local opportunities, local pressure points are going to be the critical thing to know about. And international law scholars and activists in NGOs that are based in places like Washington or New York or Geneva, or even in urban centers in countries like Ethiopia, may not be the most knowledgeable people to answer your question. There are conundrums, and there are paradoxes and frustrations, but there are also opportunities that we may not know anything about, or may actually even look perverse to us. One example, and just something to point out, again, when there's a woman at New York University named Sally Merry, M-E-R-R-Y, who writes, she's an anthropologist who studies the local implementation of human rights principles in communities. And one of the points that she has made is that some of the local, for example, in some Muslim communities, the language of the Quran, which can easily be cited as in support of women's oppression, also becomes a language for people who understand it within their community of liberation and equality. An outsider might say religion is the problem, these people are too dominated by their, so we have to get religion, we have to weaken religion or the force of religion on women's lives. Well, no. That, besides being a kind of absurd thing for someone, an outsider, to say, there are resources there which local people will have to work on. So in choosing where to put your emphasis, I think the first step is to learn from people and try to be helpful to them through an agenda that they set. Paige? Yeah.
What did that data came from talk at all about the comfort level of women being surveyed and answering these questions? I mean, like, what's the possibility that her opinion is way of a woman just not answering the question she doesn't feel comfortable answering?
I would have to go back and read the report with a little more care to know how, if I could even tell from their report.
It just seems like a possibility. I mean, that would be probably what I would do if I didn't want to answer this.
Yeah, now, although the sexual satisfaction one is only one of, fits with their pattern. But yeah, they may just say, gee, but that may be saying something too, relative comfort.
What's interesting is that would be a problem and a related problem as well, that women were much less comfortable answering these questions. But it would also suggest a slightly different way of intervening if you wanted to achieve greater equality in the comfort level and in the agree-disagree as well. It wouldn't be all about trying to empower people to make decisions. It might have more to do with, and to develop opinions and so on. It would have more to do with women becoming comfortable expressing, or in a mixed group, or with answering questions, or where they feel they're being tested, or whatever the particular problem is. And so it reveals something, but you're right, it's a really nuanced sort of point for intervening. And I think all of that speaks to your point that I consider really different from what I've ever heard before about use of a human rights framework, and that is its usefulness for the internalization of and the reconceptualization of a person's problem, and thus what they either individually or more collectively might do about it.
I mean, we actually have language that we sometimes use in bioethics, and Chris Engelhardt, I think, is the distinction between unfortunate and unfair. If a problem is seen as merely a bad luck of the draw, or things just didn't work out very well for me, and I just have to deal with that, that may lead to different kinds of reactions and responses than to define the problem as an unfairness, which calls up a whole different scale of meanings. And I think the human rights movement, that is where I would see they rhetorically would get the mileage, because they're now saying, yeah, it's not just a bad deal that you don't get to speak your mind, but that's a violation of something that you are owed. And again, philosophers argue about, well, how can you really justify that? But as a political and rhetorical thing, I think it has some power.
It's like we're out of
If there's nothing further, then we will thank you.
Okay.